Okay, welcome everyone. We're delighted to have you joining us today for a workshop on public art. If you would like to turn your cameras on, that would be great. The idea of the workshop is to make it more interactive and more hands-on. We have a very hands-on artist and teacher in the Zoom space with us. And so the idea of the workshop is, yes, there's going to be a lecture component, but I hope that you will get to participate, ask questions, maybe ask questions live. All right, so let's begin. Center for Art Law has been doing a lot of talking, and we probably should be doing a little bit more listening. So workshops is that kind of idea. I'm delighted to have Rose DeSiano, a friend of mine, an artist and professor of fine arts, answering the call of how does it really work, public art commissions? So for those of you who are new to the Center for Art Law, here's a little plug. We do a lot of educational programs. We study together, we learn, and we share information as our research is done and ready for sharing. If you are premium members, you get to enjoy lots of our articles and summaries and events freely. So if you're not members yet, consider subscribing in 2022. And for the upcoming events, these are just a couple of selections. There's going to be a very interesting conference on catalog raisonné uses, and the center is hosting one of its clinics in December, Artist Legacy and Estate Planning Clinic. So if that's a subject of interest for you, please consider taking a look at our offerings. All right, so what are we discussing today? We started thinking about public art, honestly, probably because of street art and graffiti first, but it turned out that public art is a huge area of its own. We discussed the subject briefly in a program earlier this year. If you attended it, wonderful. If you haven't, the program has been recorded and we're happy to share it with you because we're really very appreciative of you participating in this workshop. And one of the discussions that came out through that webinar, heavy lifting in public art, is yes, there are lots of areas to consider. Where do we start as artists? What happens if, sculpture falls on somebody's head? Is the artist's career over, or there is something that can be done beforehand? And so Rose is going to talk to us about the work that she has been doing. One of her pieces, actually not one of her pieces, but a number of her pieces are on display in Brooklyn right now at Prospect Park. She has been showing her photographs and photo sculptures, not only in New York, but San Diego and Cleveland. And she teaches photography and sculpture to a group of artists. So if any of her students are in the room, welcome. Rose, would you mind taking us into the realm of how an artist does public art commissions? And this is just a reminder for those of you who are not receiving our newsletters, etc. Take a look at the events on the calendar and subscribe. But Rose, we're ready to learn, and we are inviting all of you to put questions into chat during the main presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Great, thank you. I think I have to share mine. All right. Oops. Sorry, jumped around there. All right, are we seeing everything we should be seeing? Excellent. So first I want to welcome everybody and thank everybody for coming. It's exciting to come speak about a practice around the other side, which is basically the underpinnings of the creative process. But in order to get to all the things that I think are relevant to this particular presentation, I wanted to talk a little bit about my own practice, and then also about what is happening in public art at the moment, and then how that could either help you develop your own public art practice or look at other people's public art practices perhaps differently. So I wrote this presentation kind of from the framework of the image that was used on the public presentation announcement, and then also as if you were curious and interested in building your own practice. And that, I think, allowed me to touch upon all the different aspects of public art and kind of the contractual, the clauses and the concerns that you might have in a practice like that. So the piece that was in the advertisement for the workshop is Absent Monuments, which is an ongoing series, which is also something I want to address, of these obelisks that stand in various locations throughout. At this point, it's only been New York, but actually they're going to be traveling again this summer, and we're going to start going to Delaware. So what basically this is a series of obelisks that honor the history of the landscape they're installed upon. And that was really a reaction to a combination of things. I was a landscape photographer prior to being a sculptor. I'll explain my career as an accidental sculptor. And I was interested in the way history is held in a landscape. And then I became interested in how it's unmarked. Oftentimes we're unaware of the complexities of where we live, the complexities of the spaces we inhabit. And so I created this series where I built these mirrored obelisks that on the base of them had tiles, Delft tile references. So you're looking at the Dutch kind of influence of the New York City. And all the histories that were built into this particular installation is in Jamaica, Queens. So we're looking at the histories built into this particular area of New York City. And then the top part is a mirror, because I'm very interested in kind of continuing the language of photography. So a lot of reflection, you'll see a lot of reflections, you'll see a lot of refraction of light. Optical illusions exist throughout my work, because in the end, I am very interested in the way perception exists in photographic and sculptural language. So the people are then mirrored into this presentation, and they're able to be a part of the history and of the present day Rufus King Park, which is exactly where this piece was installed. It traveled, as I said. It's a series that I am interested in kind of bringing to new locations, and it's updated each time that it goes someplace. So this was another 2 years later I did in Dumbo, actually not too far from your offices. And so this is Brooklyn waterfronts, and I dealt specifically with the kind of political and social influences of the waterfront in New York City, starting from revolutionary times all the way up to contemporary times. So the images on the bottom shifted from, on the left-hand side, you're seeing the Jamaica Queens installation, where I was talking about the integration of the school systems. I was talking about basically how it was a very prevalent immigrant area. And on the right-hand side, you're looking at women working in the Brooklyn Navy Yards and doing construction on the factory stuff for World War I. And then also you're looking at flag workers as well. So you're seeing how in each site I'm taking in the history and working with that in the imagery. And I'm going to talk a bit about imagery later, because as a law presentation, I think that's entirely important, because who I'm working with and how I use the images and how I get permission to use those images is actually a very, very big part of my practice. So again, we're looking at a close-up here dealing with the slavery dynamics of the Brooklyn waterfront, which there is quite a complex history if you're not familiar with it. I wanted to jump out of my own practice and into a bigger practice. And I'm not going to spend the entire presentation talking about monuments in public art, because I know there's a much broader dialogue happening and I participate in the broader dialogue. But I think it'd be impossible to ignore what's happening in the United States and also internationally at the moment. And so this is the cover of National Geographic. This is a photograph taken by Chris Graves. I think it's probably, in my mind, the most iconic image of 2020. And it's dialogue about not only Black Lives Matter, but George Floyd, but also talking about the fact that we're done with having public spaces made for us in a way that we don't feel represent us. And so I think that's a huge part of public art right now. So even if you're not actually building monuments or dealing with monument culture directly, you are, because you're recreating the public landscape of how we represent ourselves by putting artwork in a public sphere. And if you say to yourself, I'm not interested in addressing politics in my art, that's a statement in and of itself. So this is an image looking at Confederate G.B. Stewart being removed from Richmond, Virginia. I just think it's a really powerful photograph to say public art matters, right? If you can be this kind of influenced in, and also angered by public art, participating in a practice of public art is challenging. There's a lot of conversation that happens. There's a lot of different opinions, and it is about working with the public in the end. This is a fabulous image, I find. These are Baltimore's Confederate statues that were removed 2 years ago, and they're literally just in a parking lot because nobody knows what to do with them. There's a long history of what people do with statues that they don't know what to do about. We could talk about what Russia did another time, but there's some interesting kind of answers / non-answers. If you're a Brooklynite, Greenwood Cemetery is now housing a controversial sculpture that was removed from Central Park. We have Dr. Sims, who was honored for being a doctor of medicine, but later really became clear that he was abusing women and Black women specifically. And so now his sculpture is in the cemetery. So there's an interesting thing happening with that. I'm not going to do a whole presentation, but I think it's important to address that removing and building public monuments or public art at all is very controversial and delicate. And if you're interested in that kind of practice, it's for you. If you're not interested in that kind of practice, it is not. So this is an earlier work that I did in Randall's Island. Randall's Island is a very complex city landscape. It historically had things on it such as, you know, quote unquote loony bins, which we absolutely don't refer to them as that anymore, but that was pretty problematic. It was not a safe or healthy place. We have Robert Moses, which if you're at all an urban planning junkie, you're completely familiar with what he did and did not do for the city. And so I worked with the history of the landscape, talking about how Randall's Island had changed. And this is the first time that I worked with photographs from public archives. And so I wanted to talk about that. So this is entirely created from images from the New York City Parks Department Public Archive. And I had to work with the archivist and get permission for it. There was a lot of, you know, check the boxes, what are you doing? And it's a pretty staid work. I merely represented buildings. You'll see here on the left-hand side actually is a photograph of a very controversial all-boys orphanage. And so there is language built in where I'm questioning the usage of this island from the city and the history's past, and I'm using city photographs. So that gets complicated. But I think I try to approach it in a way that it's merely presenting or bringing to the surface history rather than necessarily being kind of an active pushback or controversial conversation happening with the Parks Department. And I think that's why I've been able to succeed. There's this balance between being able to bring up topics and also being too didactic that the Parks Department wouldn't support it. So something I wanted to bring up, and then I'm going to move away from the monuments, is the, this is out of sequence, sorry, Monument Lab, which is an organization based out of Philadelphia, which is working with how monuments are being used, taken apart, dismantled, and rebuilt throughout the United States. They're really fascinating. They support artists individually making new works, but they also just recently published this incredibly phenomenal findings, which are calling the National Monument Audit, in which they kind of summarize what the landscape of monuments in the US look like. And it really helps you understand how we use public art to present ourselves to each other, but also how it is used to kind of force us to stay in the boxes that were built maybe years and years and years ago. So this is something I found really fascinating. Working with their information and their organizational data has actually influenced my creative practice. So I would really recommend checking them out if you're interested in this dialogue at all. So from that, this is a piece that I did in Brooklyn as well, if you know the Stone House in Park Slope area, and it was called Between Monuments. And what I was working on here is photographing monuments throughout the US, and then talking about the things that went undiscussed in between them. So on the right-hand side, you're seeing a picture of a family from the African-American community in Olmsted leveled in order to create Central Park. And so while Central Park is this revered location, and there is a statue to Olmsted there is a statue to Olmsted in the US, this part of the conversation is not had. Then we're also showing a picture of Robert Moses. You could see him on the left-hand side. And then of course, you couldn't talk about Robert Moses unless you talked about little Jane. So there's talking about what is happening in between the monuments and the negative histories or the less discussed controversial histories between the monuments that we've become so comfortable in seeing. Before you logged in, I was briefly talking about how I've started a series of NFTs. This NFT project is being sponsored by a series of organizations, LMCC, which is the Lower Manhattan Community Council, which if you're not familiar with them, they're a really, really powerful and really dynamic arts organization based out of Lower Manhattan. And what I'm working with is monuments to women, unsung heroines. So we have Cecily Chang, who is a transgender kind of revolutionary out of San Francisco. And on the left-hand side, we have two prominent Indian women that dealt with education and medicine in in the early 1900s. So what I was looking at here is how to build these virtual monuments during a pandemic. I had an exhibition that was canceled, and then suddenly I started thinking about what if people suggested to me who makes a monument. And so all the submissions to this series, Unsung Heroines, are from the public. And so if you're interested, you can go on my website and you could submit, and I'd be very happy to virtually create a monument for you. This is a display that happened at Federal Hall. I was invited to exhibit the Unsung Heroines series there as a part of kind of a revolution of how women are changing the way monuments are seen in the US. And this just came down in July. I'm going to go a little faster so we can get to the nitty gritty, but this is works that, again, doing to honor various women that are unsung. This was specifically for Cleveland. The shapes and the forms of my sculptures are really threefold. One, I'm interested in the way forms existed throughout history that have meaning. Two, I'm interested in optical illusions because that's my history of photography. And then finally, I'm interested in interactivity and engagement. Engagement is a massive part of public art, making work that the public feels like they can be a part of or participate with. And so if you're looking at these spheres, they move, they have mirrors, they're engaging in that way, and people are able to kind of interact with them and fold themselves into the artwork again. So all of my choices are really fueled by the fact that a public art practice is about viewership more than anything. Jumping back to my conversation about photographs and archives, they're a huge component of my practice is, I dare to use this word, but education. So every work that I do has a kind of paper trail to it. Here I'm looking at the Reflect and Refract series done in Cleveland, and I'm telling you about the individuals that are highlighted in the sculptures, the various women that need to be praised. Jumping forward to the park project that's up right now in Prospect Park, if you're in the area, I would love it if you want to go check it out. Again, dealing with the Parks Department Photo Archive, but also now dealing with the Brooklyn Public Library and also dealing with the Prospect Park Alliance. So once you start getting into multiple organizations sponsoring and supporting a project, you start getting into the legal of it, right? That's when things get interesting. So who gets credit? How clear is it? Who owns what image? Why are you using said image and not the other image? And so that's another place in which having a website that backs up what I'm doing and explains what I'm doing is not only interesting to me as an educator, but also necessary as a public artist. I have to make it clear who I'm working with and what permission I was given to use what images. So the photographs in this series are from, again, as I said, the Brooklyn Public Library, Henry Ford Foundation. And what I was doing was trying to represent how public parks, specifically Prospect Park, are used during time of crisis and leisure. And these images, again, are marked. There is a QR code on the base of each sculpture that allows the public to see that information. But that information is, again, as I said, not only interesting, but necessary. I have to post that linkage back to the original archives. That's part of my copyright usage policy. And so I'm looking at images here on the right-hand side of the Bread and Puppet. If you don't know them, they're a kind of a activist puppets organization based out of Vermont that's really amazing and historical and worth looking at. But I'm also still thinking about engagement. And I'm going to talk a little bit about engagement and safety in about a second. So here I have the mirrors reflecting contemporary landscape of the park, and then I have the photographs talking about the historical elements. And I'm using this lenticular. If you're not familiar with this historical photographic process, it's when you approach one image. It was painting before photography, but I prefer to give photography credit. When you approach it in one direction, it's an image, and the other direction is a different image. In this particular installation, one direction is an image of the park, and the other direction is you and the current temporary park. So you can kind of see people engaging and walking around the space. And this is what's up right now. In the posts, there are stereoscopes. So again, I'm a photo junkie. I love this kind of technology. I love the reverie of it. I love the engagement of it. And I love the fact that they're so like just dripping with this historical context. There's a lot of really fascinating stereoscopic images out of the Parks Department. And so they're looking at that inside the columns. And that brings me to something else that I wanted to talk about. When you fabricate a public artwork, you have to start thinking about accessibility. physical accessibility. You have to think about how it is safety, but mostly you have to think about how it can be used by the public in multiple ways and physical conditions. So you have some concerns similar to the way museums have ADA compliance. So this is, if you notice, this woman is looking up high at a stereoscope, and then I have down low the same image available for kids. And that, while it's not a requirement by the park, absolutely important to a product, right? You want to be thinking about that. So before I jump into the rest of it, I'm curious if there's any questions about my practice, because now I'm going to move away from my practice and start talking about the nitty gritty of a public art practice. Or should I just plow ahead? Plow ahead? All right. So we have the brief history of public art, which I'm not going to do. I just want to kind of introduce some ideas so we could talk about what builds a public art practice. So this is a very famous Anish Kapoor photograph sculpture in Chicago. This is Jeff Koons's puppy in Bilbo. Both of these artists have gallery practice before they had public art practice. And I think that's an important thing for me to mention about the kind of transition from a gallery practice into a public art practice. Accessibility, right? Jeff Koons is the king of accessibility. And so nothing more accessible than flower puppies. And that is important. We have Christo's and Jean-Claude's incredible gates, which if you didn't see the gates in Central Park, it's a phenomenal project that was temporary. And again, it's about accessibility, but in this moment, slightly more leaning towards a gallery practice where people can feel alienated, right? There's moments where people are like, why should I care about orange flags in a park? Whereas everybody knows why they should care about a flower puppy. So I think is a really interesting, I see a squint from Marina. I think is an interesting conversation about what flies in public art. And so the reason why I wanted to talk about the history of public art, this is a fabulous one. This is a sculpture that was done down in Wall Street, where sculpture Fearless Girl by Christian Visual was created to kind of go head to head with a previously existing sculpture in New York, and it kind of update this previously existing sculpture into something more relevant to contemporary times. But the important part about a public practice is why people do it, why people gravitate to it, and the history of it, but what it becomes a problem. So public art gone wrong, because I think this is what we need to talk about in order to talk about how it goes right. Very, very famous study case, Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, 1981. And what he did is he put one of his classic famous forms in the middle of an open quad in New York City, and indirectly or directly or accidentally, you'll never know and I'll never tell you, created a dark casted shadow over the entire public space where all these people had like 1 hour of their life in which they could have lunch and some sun, and he killed it. And so the question is, who are you servicing when you make a public artwork? Is it your ego? Is it the community? Are you offering them something? Are you taking something away? And so I think that's a really important aspect of public art that Richard Serra just ran right up against. He was he was fine with it, by the way. But and then you want to think about, again, who are you servicing and why are you doing this? And this is an aerial shot, so you can see how big this giant piece of metal is. And I'm a Richard Serra fan, don't get me wrong, but there's a time and a place, and this was not it. Then also incredibly important when it comes to proposals and when it comes to community development and when it comes to approval for public art projects is authorship. Something that's a little more controversial to discuss, but this was a very problematic sculpture of Martin Luther King for no other reason really than who made it. So this was a Chinese artist who had previously sculpted a form of Mao Zedong, and the public did not feel it was appropriate for somebody who had done that to then represent Martin Luther King. So the sculpture itself was not problematic, although Maya Angelou later said that Martin Luther King looked arrogant in the carvings, but that's a separate issue. But thinking about who you are when you make a work and how it's going to be perceived because of who you are is very much part of a public art practice. And so in that, kind of leading into who are you servicing once again, is your work politically charged? Is it decorative and non-confrontational? And remember your identity and your role as an author when you're making this work, because it will be what comes up in municipal conversations about whether or not this is an appropriate project. So to deny it in your own practice, in your own head, is going to come up against you later. So this piece by Ai Weiwei was well received on a cultural kind of intellectual level, but poorly received by the community. It was good fences make good neighbors, and he was absolutely speaking about immigration issues in the United States. And it was really problematic because people didn't want that in their park. But it was in Manhattan, which is also an international intellectual playground. So we have a kind of conflict of interest in various places in which you show work, because everybody is in the public. This is a very well-known piece in San Francisco, purely decorative, right? No less value, none at all, but just not going to approach this space for a sense of political statement, just approaching the space for beautification. And beautification is a really important element of public art, and especially for starting out in a practice, beautification is where you start. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So who funds private art? Private sector funding, percentage for arts programs, and municipal programs. They all have backers and funders and trustees that have ideas about where they want to send their money. And understanding where that money comes from and understanding why people are interested in sponsoring work will help you decide if this is a practice for you, and also help you decide what organizations you pursue. So, money funnels down in different ways. It goes through the cities, it goes through art funds, it goes through corporate databases. I'll explain corporate databases in a second, and private consultants, right? So a lot of people are interested in having public art, and some people legally are required to have it. If you're not familiar with the 1%, that is when a portion of your property value in New York City, and other cities have this as well, has to go towards the production of public art. So you'll see this kind of appear in corporate funding, but you'll also see this in New York City's public arts funding in the municipal, right? The percentage for the arts means this money is dog-eared specifically for that. And where that money goes, though, becomes questionable. So that's where you have art funds. Oops. I'm actually just I included a couple of slides for you, and they're my resource list as well, because New York City is a beast. We all know, a lot of us live there. And so when you start talking about starting your career, I don't start with New York, is all I have to say for that. But you can start with municipal systems. So Scottsdale Public Art is incredibly well funded. They're incredibly engaging. They are competitive, but there's a dialogue to be had, right? Whereas if you approach New York off the bat, you're not going to really have much of a conversation there. Pasadena is another place that's really interested in having public art, and maybe having public art from lesser known or lesser established artists. So you really have to kind of think about municipal outside of New York City. I know we have the most money, but we also have the most competition. So what happens to this 1% money? This is where things get a little bit complicated. A lot of organizations and corporate companies don't want to deal with this at all, because it's complicated. And so what they do is they reach out to things like the Public Art Fund, and they say, hey, I have to do 1% of this property. I have to do 1% of this. Find me an artist, get it going, stamp it, and put it out there. And that's what happens. And so the money is not different for these organizations. It's funneled through different organizations. So this could be corporate funding happening in a public organization like the Public Art Fund. And that's, again, a very big one. I did a piece with with Land, which is basically the Cleveland version of the Public Art Fund. And again, the same. The public library system wanted to do public art, didn't want to deal with it. They hire Land Studio to deal with it. And so there's this way in which money and kind of the connection between the place that's going to organize it and exhibit it and the artists happen. And it's that middle space where you have these organizations that rechannel the money. Coda work. This is an example that I wanted to show you as a corporate database. So in addition to having organizations like the Public Art Fund, which usually have community components to it, and Land Studio, which are interested in community components, some corporations have no interest in any community component whatsoever, and they're going to go for something like this, CodaWorks. This is a corporate database in which you apply for a portfolio, you get put in the system, and they literally have a drop-down menu for the corporations. And they're like, I want this. I want it to be a theme of this. I want it to be put here, and I want it to be this much money. Search, and voila, you get yourself a very pretty parking structure. I'm not devaluing this at all, but it is a very different tract. And it is absolutely 100% what I was talking about before about beautification and decorative, right? They're not interested in having political conversations for the most part through an organization like this. Very valuable, and they put you in touch with a lot of interesting projects that you would not know about otherwise. So as an artist, these are things that you would want to engage with. And then you have the very delicate, pristine, kind of private curator. That's a different beast as well, right? This is somebody that works with individuals, individual companies, individual art collectors. They're interested in public art. They want to be a part of the dialogue. They're going to be interested in a combination of beautification and political conversations, right? There's these public curating, and there's many of these. I just gave this as an example. I supplied some other examples in an email I sent over. They're interested in really meeting and knowing artists and representing you. They function more like a gallery, but they're specifically for public art. And if you're interested in this, it's also a way to attach yourself to money that is not through municipal systems. So I did the drop down menu here so you can see this: hotel, yachts, aircrafts, corporate art, public art. So you're really not talking about the same pool of money as you're talking about the 1%. So there are different funnels, and you might want to look and decide which ones are appropriate for you. So how do you get started? I think that's a really important question. There's a lot of avenues. Start with community collaborations. There's a lot of money available for things that engage the community. This means you're making work with somebody, not for somebody, right? You're doing public murals. This is LEAP is a program that works with the Board of Education in New York City. Other cities have similar programs. There are programs that are not affiliated with the Board of Education. And so it brings artists into community to create public art through a collaborative process, because in the end, public art is about community, right? So before you're allowed to tell the community what they should be looking at, you should probably work with the community to see what they're interested in making and seeing themselves. And so I think starting with a community collaborative practice is really important, not only to get your foot in the door, but also to get your head in the right game. Like, remember who you're serving and what you're doing. This is another one based out of Pittsburgh that I really like, this organization, Office of Public Art. And they work both with kind of neighborhood ally programs and the Board of Ed of Pittsburgh. So they're out there. There's quite a few of them, and they're really important, and I think really valuable to support as a practicing artist. I consider myself supporting their mission by working with them. Festivals. Festivals are a really interesting way to start out as well, because they're short-lived. You don't have to worry about as much as you would if you want something to stay up for 10 months, 2 months, in perpetuity, whatever it might be. And you also have the framework of an organization doing everything for you. And I'm going to jump into that when we get to the legalese. So this is a festival called Powwow based out of Long Beach. There are more festivals based on murals and flatworks, but definitely this is a sculptural based festival. This is Bright Walls, which is one of the longest running mural festivals in the US. It started in 2014. They have their application right on the website. There's kind of no complexity there, right? You know, if they like your image, you're in it. So this is in Michigan. Jersey City Mural Festival, right? That's another festival that's been running probably since 2015, 16. And these are places where you can reach out to them directly. There's application processes. It's not about this kind of mysterious curator picking you out from a hat. It's really about showing you what you're interested in and getting on the ground. So once you kind of build that into your practice, you can move into small solo projects. I grabbed this off the internet. I didn't participate in this at all, but I've seen them a bunch and I actually think they're quite wonderful, where basically the municipal departments and arts councils have some sort of blight that they identify, and then they throw a little bit of money at it. And so this is the electrical box art call, $350, enough to buy your supplies, enough to get your name out there. And I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but it's very true because we're all employed in this chat. If people know that you get the job done and you're not a royal pain, it helps, right? So if you have a positive experience with a project like this, and someone says, oh, she was lovely, he was lovely, they were lovely to work with, that is worth its weight in gold in public art, because it is a community practice. It's not a diva artist in your studio practice. It's a very different beast. So I really actually think these are valuable and important to start with. And then you can move your way into open calls. So open calls, I grabbed this particular resource because it's one that I used in the past and I had success with it. They're basically an aggregator for public art calls. you're looking at projects with a budget of $500,000 all the way to projects of $200. And so it's a really wide range. It's a great resource, but that's how you would kind of get your foot in there again and again and again, right? These open call processes. It is, again, as I said, very different because you are dealing with municipal, because you are dealing with corporations, you are dealing with, frankly, a lot of people that don't know anything about art. It's a different practice, right? You apply for grants. It's a much more corporate based practice. It's not the same as you would be dealing with curators and galleries and critics like that. So you got a commission, now what? This is where I think Arena and I had our conversation when we first talked about doing this presentation. And so I am telling you this right out. I know some of you are probably attorneys on this. So I'm gonna say I am not. What I am is someone with living experience. I am someone who's done projects, signed contracts, and gone, oh, damn it, that was not the right thing to sign. So I'm going to speak about it in that context. I'm not giving any legal advice to anyone. Major things to look at. Double check the language in your contract. If you don't understand the language, which is 80% of the time for me, ask somebody. Richard Serra, who we talked about earlier, someone said, well, what's the difference between your gallery practice and your public art practice? And he said, I don't have a gallerist, I have an attorney. If you get into this, get yourself an attorney if you're not one yourself, because it is a complicated field. So ownership, that's the thing artists always look at first, right? People, they want to know if they own their work. They want to know who's using the work, who's talking about the work. That's something that's built into our frame of mind already. So it's here, it's in public art as well. So do you own the work once it's installed? Can the work be sold to a private owner in a third party sale after the duration of your contract? That one happened to me. I thought it was just coming down. Turned out they sold it to someone for way more money than I was paid to make it. Can you sell your work of art? Sometimes the organization doesn't want the work after a temporary installation. They're happy to give it back to you, but there might be a clause that though you can physically have it, you can't resell it. So because we're a small group, I'll tell you the nitty gritty of the piece that's in Prospect Park. The armature of the piece in Prospect Park is actually from an installation I had in Ohio. And I was legally allowed to do that. I was not legally allowed to use the images because those were copyright and belonged to the Cleveland Public Library system, but I was permitted to use the metal. So there is important ways to look at the ownership clauses in your artwork. Do you have the right to create, reproduce a series or editions? So I talked about my Absent Monument series of the obelisks. I had to pull that work out of a show on Governor's Island 2 years ago because in the contract language, I was no longer able to exhibit or recreate new versions of it after exhibiting it. And since my intention for that work was to be a traveling series, that was a no-go for me. So you do have to pay attention to the what happens after your contract clause, because it's not only about the moment, it's about what happens to ownership after. So ownership, intellectual properties, these are things that you should jump out at you. I grabbed a few things that I've read over contracts that I've been looking at and went, I don't know about that one. So owner intellectual properties, it says here, irrevocable, unlimited irrevocable license to do the following with respect, this case was a mural. What happens after that colon is wildly important. I have been sent contracts where there's nothing after that colon and they say, oh, we'll get back to that later. Do not get back to that later, get back to that now. But basically it says that they are allowed to do whatever they want with it after the case, right? That it's theirs and you own no right to it in any way. Waiving of artist rights. This is something I didn't even know existed. So an actual clause can be that you waive all your rights to the work from every moment after presenting it. Means you don't have ownership of the imagery, you don't have ownership of the documentation of it, you have no ownership in any way of this project. Now there are definite kind of like, there's a sliding scale of what can go into that language, but definitely look at the waiver of artist rights when you're talking about ownership, because that's where you're going to find yourself in trouble. So it says specifically artist hereby waives any and all such claims against the owner or any future owners of the property. So that means you have nothing to say forever after this work is showed with them. I'm simplifying it. Obviously, you guys are attorneys, some of you, so you'll be able to know about it better. But those are two places that I think is important to look. And then the place that is not in the general headspace of an artist, I think ownership and understanding your rights as an artist tends to go towards the visuals. But in public art, you have a second category that you have to pay attention to: safety of your work and your reputation. So one of the things I didn't really quite understand is maintenance and the right to remove. The right to remove is a lot more complex than I thought. Basically, if you have a contract that says your work needs to be up for a year and someone trashes it in that year, and there's no clause in there that says what to do with it, you have to, out of pocket many times, fix it for that year. The right to remove is a negotiation category that says under, I hit X, Y amount, like Z amount of money, I'm not going to fix it. I'm going to take it down. And this relationship is over and it's not my fault or my problem. And I always put the right to remove in there for a reason that maybe not be obvious, is that sometimes the city is willing to let an artwork of yours linger in a state of disgust. And that's your reputation, right? So suddenly you have a piece of your work that they're not interested in maintaining because the contract says they will maintain it, right? So you think you won. You're like, oh, the contract says they're going to maintain it. But in actuality, they never get to it. And so you can't do anything about it. And it sits there and it makes you look poorly. So the right to remove is basically saying, if I don't like the way this looks and you're not maintaining it the way I want it to be maintained, I'm allowed to take this down prior to the end of our contract. End of story. And that's something that I think is really, really important. So, so the obligation of artists to identify reimbursements is another one. Basically, paying attention to what the city says it costs to fix something. That's something that I've run into as well. They're like, it's going to cost millions of dollars to put white paint on it. It's like, no, it's not. No, it's not. And I'm not going to pay you millions of dollars to put white paint on my sculpture. So making it really clear, having a monetary value in there, that after a certain number, you're not going to play this kind of negotiation game where you're going to give them money to maintain your work is wildly important. Safety of your finances. This is something, obviously, when you're doing electrical boxes, I don't think you have to worry about. But when you start moving into large metal sculptures in Prospect Park that have teams of teenagers leaping on it on a regular basis, you do have to think about this. So how is your finances safeguarded against your art practice? Liability insurance, workers insurance, umbrella insurance, and then finally, I think what I perceive as like the highest level of coverage, which is where I'm now, is an LLC. So how does that work? Before you even get to worrying about whether or not they're going to sue you, you should start thinking about making work where they won't sue you. So this is a great example of an interactive art piece that was not meant to be interactive, right? Assume that whatever you're going to build is going to become interactive. And in that, think about safety. I think it's easier for me because I've been a teacher for decades and now I have a toddler. So I look at something and I can see 100 ways in which my kid can kill themselves before I even make it. But that, as an artist in the public sphere, you have to do that for yourself. Some cities will have engineer drawings signed off on in which they will tell you if it's safe. Many cities will say it's the responsibility of the artist and leave you to it. So either you get yourself an engineer because you don't trust your own instincts, or you get your fear of killing toddler game on and you look at your sculpture and think about that. So this image is actually a great image. It's a smooth surface. There's nothing protruding. There's nothing you can fall out of higher than 2 feet. There's no lips. What I mean by lips, if you look at that stone that's holding up the kind of top metal sculpture piece, you can't actually climb on that part. And that's intentional. There's too much of a gradation and there's no like foot place to put a foot there. That is with great intention. So thinking about the design of your work before you even get to, if someone hurts themselves on your work, you want to remove options for getting hurt. If something happens and you do get hurt, somebody does get hurt, insurance. They oftentimes will say a city's risk manager will provide to you exactly what it is that you should have in your coverage. You don't care. That's to cover them. That's not to cover you. They're going to tell you, oh, it's fine if you get X, Y, or Z. Double check if X, Y, or Z covers you, because it might just be covering the city. So risk management clauses is always a problem for me. As soon as I see that, I know that they're not looking out for my interest. That's very much for the city or that particular person's interest, not my own. How can they come for money when it comes for insurance? This is an interesting thing that I've learned the hard way. I've not been sued, by the way. I just want to be cleared. I've definitely been in negotiations of heated performance, I would call. But can you file, you can file under your personal home renter's insurance, right? So you can actually include your sculptures the way you would insure a, a piece of jewelry. That does not actually cover the work damage to somebody else. That covers the damage to your artwork, which is important. Then you can sue, they can sue for related professional income. If they get hurt, they can sue you. But the worst part that I recently understood is that they can come for your personal and family assets. If you are not a company and you make a public sculpture and somebody hurts them on it and your spouse has an income, that spouse's income is up for suing game, free game. And the way to kind of block that, this is majorly important, is to think about the way in which they can come for you. So they can come for you as your business, and they can come for you as a personal person, as an individual. And if you create an LLC, they can't come for your personal. And that is something that I think is not really explained to many public artists as their career grows. And oftentimes we're under this false assumption that because we're in the parks department, that somehow the park is the person that's responsible or the over umbrella organization is responsible, but they're not. Unless that's really specified and clarified in your contracts, you are always the one responsible, always, always, always. So I talked about how to get started. And one of the reasons why I talked about the benefits of festivals. So festivals file for city permits. Festivals provide your installation crew, because once you start talking about installation crew, you're now talking about workers insurance, right? You have employment. If they get hurt on the job installing, that's a separate category of problems. Festival covers liability, that's for viewership and audience, and they hold the employee insurance. So when you first get started, being a part of a larger moving organization like a festival is really important because you don't know any of this stuff yet. And you're not set up for this stuff yet. I wouldn't go out and put a giant piece of metal in a park unless you have your LLC set up. So this is kind of the framework of what is concerning for a public artist, kind of legally and financially. And this is why being under the umbrella of an organization or festival in your early stages is really, really important. The last part I'm going to talk about, and then I'll open up for questions, is basically, does your public art equal public use? And this is not about you getting sued. This is about you suing, which is maybe something you hadn't really thought about, is that once your work is part of the public landscape, you do lose your right to control where your artwork appears to a certain degree, right? And it's kind of set up with a very funny clause, which is recognized stature, which is to what I would like to refer to a mid-career artist, the worst term you want to see fly across a page, because there you are again, proving your value to the universe one more time. So basically, unless you can prove that it has cultural value or has public value, you lose your ability to defend how it's used by the public. So the example I like to talk about is when you're on the other end of that, when you can absolutely prove that you are of recognized stature, is going back to the earlier image that I showed you of Anish Kapoor's Chicago piece, is that he sued the NRA and he won. What happened is the NRA did some sort of like pop-up video right in front of the piece, didn't speak to him, didn't ask for a waiver, didn't nothing. And he sued them and said that he didn't want to be associated with their political message. And he was able to do that because he was recognizable as being associated, right? They're like, oh yes, that is an Anish Kapoor behind the NRA. I get it. There's a direct connection. They're going to be a little less concerned about Rose DeSiano being upset about the fact that she's somehow intertwined with the NRA. So I do know that I was actually in the backdrop to a fairly provocative and slightly controversial hip hop video when I had my piece in Randall's Island. I didn't sue. I didn't have the bandwidth at the time to do it. It was almost 9 years ago before I really understood. And I approached an attorney, and the attorney said, yeah, but you're going to have to prove why your art is more important than their art. So I kind of let that sit. But it is something to be thoughtful of when you are in the public sphere. If that's something you can't sit with in the early part of your career, knowing that you might accidentally become a part of a message you're not happy with, that is a part of public art practices. So I think I've kind of bounced all over the place, and I'm going to end with this one. And I think I made it sound pretty negative at the end, and it's not. It's actually an awesome practice. I think I might have even abandoned ship in terms of being an artist if I hadn't found myself in this sphere. And this one is actually for Arena. So I do have a piece currently in Prospect Park, as I mentioned, which is not far from where I live, which is not far from where Arena used to live, because we used to live near each other. And in this photograph are two pictures of our neighbors that I got texted to me this past week. So knowing that your work is kind of out in the public and being enjoyed, and it coming back to you through these avenues makes every part of potentially being sued worth it. And so, yeah, so this is where I'll end with it, just kind of enjoying seeing people engaging with the work, and they're my neighbors, they're my community. And so it was really awesome to see that. And so these were from us. And so these are two Muse families.
Thank you so much, Rose. This was a really great presentation, and you have made us look at the legal issues with the eyes of an artist, a very active and very well-experienced artist. So hopefully some of the lessons learned by you can be shared, and so there's a little bit less of the painful process in the learning and maybe building on experiences. Thank you very much for the comments, Lisa. You have posted a lot of really wonderful comments, informative, and there's a question that you posed earlier. Rose, you have worked with various Park Service departments. The question was if National Park Service is any different or very similar, and how can some contracts differ, or in your experience, how different states or federal versus state players have worked with public artists?
That's actually an interesting question. So the piece that I showed in Federal Hall, which was the banner works talking about the Unsung Heroine series, that Federal Hall is actually a national park building, a national monument, a national parks department building. And they do have very different language in that I was not actually permitted to participate unless I was an LLC. So that was interesting for the first time. They were kind of defending themselves. They don't want to work with individuals, basically, is what they want to work with companies, because there is a framework in place. So that's something I noted. And that was interesting to kind of experience that. I had it lined up at the time, so it wasn't an issue, but that's one difference between national and state level. Then I think, I made the joke about dealing with New York versus dealing other cities. You really have to look at the history of a city. It's not just the wealth. It has to do, you guys, many of you attorneys know this. I have never shown in the state of Pennsylvania. I work in Pennsylvania. I'm very familiar with Pennsylvania. Their public usage clauses are so bizarre that they truly stand in the way of their own public art practice. Philadelphia has some sort of acceptances because of the way, honestly, I think the way in which the colonies were established, I'm not joking, that's how far back these public usage rules go. But different states are very different, and they're directly linked to their early years of public usage.
Got it. Thank you. We got a comment about maybe getting a map going with various public art installations that you have mentioned. If there is such a document or a resource out there, we'll try to find it. But Rose, how are public artworks intended for permanent use differ from public art intended for temporary display?
It's interesting, and I talked about Monument Labs and their monument audit project, and that was a big part of their goal to actually distinguish how public and permanent monument public artworks are talked about and installed versus temporary. At the moment, it's actually a political conversation. I don't know if the person who asked that question knew it, but there is a real issue with how monuments need to change to represent communities, right? That we can't sit with the burden of our history if our history has been proven to be problematic. And so having temporary works is a preference at the moment, which I know as a professional kind of trajectory, one might say, oh, the big goal would be to have something permanent and forever. But there's actually a conversation happening about how that does not service the communities. So that's one thing. It's an indirect answer to that question, just because the idea of temporary versus permanent is really important and happening in the dialogue at the moment. In terms of permanent, you would probably be leaning towards more of a corporate funding, right? That's someone who's going to have a 1% clause. They're going to be having like a requirement to have that work exist in perpetuity. So it's a done and done situation for them, right? They spend the money, it's resolved, it's installed. And that's a lot while you'll see a fair amount of commissioned and purchased artwork in the lobbies of major corporation offices, right? That's a permanent piece. I don't know if that's a direct answer to that question, but a lot of those, it's very rare that a municipal system at this moment would be installing a permanent work. Having said that, I know Hank Willis Thomas just installed a really prominent and important sculpture in downtown Brooklyn. You should definitely check out his work. And it was basically kind of a monument and sculpture to Black lives.
Thank you. If there are any questions, I invite you to put them in the chat, or if there's an artist or a lawyer or any of the members of the audience, if they want to say something, you can raise your hand. Otherwise, I want to thank Minelli for being an amazing host, for putting together the handouts and manning this program. You guys will be receiving the handouts again. We're hoping you will fill out the survey for us so we know what is working, what can be improved. And Rose, I have a last question for you, but if there are more questions that come up, there might be another one. How bittersweet or how difficult it is to see some of your, to see the temporary works being dismantled, and what happens to them after the show is over?
Well, it's actually interesting because it's not only a comment of bittersweet, but I do have a bit of I don't know what I want to say, kind of awareness of my usage of materials. So I shifted to predominantly metal at this point, which is not only because it's more robust and for safety purposes and so on and so forth, but because the recycling of it actually is more efficient and effective. My first piece had all manner of materials for rigging and some other stuff, and I had to actually throw it in a dump. And the first time I did that, aside from my emotional attachment to my creative process, I was actually sickened by the large heap of junk I created. So I am very much interested in a sustainable practice that involves recycling, materials that can be used again. I actually build my work with the intent of the parts being capable of becoming something else, but that's a personal practice. So that's just about sustainability there. And then in terms of emotionally, I'm not, it's terrible to say, I am a nostalgic person, but I'm a photographer. So if the pictures look good, if I have them forever, I'm okay. I'm okay. The thing that kills me is when I know, like there was a couple of works during the pandemic, I wasn't able to get photographed the way I wanted photographed because I couldn't get there. And that was hard for me to know that it came, it went, and I didn't have the photographic experience record. But that's just me as a photographer. The document is key.
Do you get your photographs registered with the Copyright Office?
I do. Usually before I do a PR launch, those images are, because that's all that's left, right? And I guess if I wanted to become Christo in my old age, I could actually sell those images, but I haven't gotten there.
You have a few decades to go. I think. All right. Thank you so much for being our teacher today and for telling us about your experience. We are maybe going to make a map of the spaces that you have described. I don't want to overpromise, but
I want to say that there are actually apps, public art apps, and I will dig up some of my favorites and send them your way. But there are people trying to do that. A Monument Lab has one, but it's specifically geared towards political works. But I'll dig up some of those resources.
Thank you, Rose. You are always welcome to come back as a speaker or as a guest. If there are topics that you think we need to cover in the future, let us know. And for the rest of our attendees, thank you so much for joining us today. We do look forward to your feedback. And we look forward to seeing you again and again at the Center for Art Law. Thank you very much.
Thank you.